Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Alexis Lowry. I'm Associate Curator here at Dia Foundation, and I organize the DiaTalks series where we invite curators, scholars, and other kinds of creative thinkers to consider works on view in the collection. And before we get too far into the meat of today's event, I want to first thank you all for joining us, and also thank everyone on Dia's staff who makes the DiaTalk events possible, but particularly Dan Wolf and Kathleen Anderson and the entire Visitor Experiences staff, who are lovely. So, I'm so excited for today. When Dia acquired Spiral Jetty in 1999 with the help of Robert Smithson's widow. Spiral Jetty is a work by Robert Smithson that was completed in 1970. When Dia acquired the work with the help of Nancy Holt, Smithson's widow, it was immediately institutionally clear that we were going to need partners on the ground to help preserve the legacy of the work and maintain it. And we're an organization that's based in New York City, so that was a little bit of a complication for us to consider. And what ended up happening is we formed a partnership that consists of 3 different organizations in addition to Dia: the Utah Museum of Fine Arts at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. It's a wonderful museum and the sort of hub of contemporary art in the city. If you have never been and you're on your way to go see Spiral Jetty, you should stop there. The Smithson Foundation, which, as you can imagine, is an organization that advocates for the legacy of these 2 great artists, and the Great Salt Lake Institute at Westminster College. So today I'm really thrilled to introduce our speakers, Dr. Bonnie Baxter and Jaimi Butler, who run the Great Salt Lake Institute and who advise the partnership, Dia's partnership, for the Spiral Jetty on environmental issues, site maintenance, questions of accessibility that pertain to the jetty. And I'm getting to the pelicans. I got a pelican pin today. Okay, so there are no 2 people on the planet, quite literally, that know more about the climactic conditions of the Great Salt Lake, and we're extraordinarily lucky to have them here today to tell us about the intersection of their scientific research with this work of art. And I think in particular how a work of art has ended up shaping some of the research that you do, and a kind of unexpected alliance between the creative arts and the sciences. So Bonnie is the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute. And this is you know this well. I took it from the website. But I couldn't say it better because it's got a lot of words that I've never heard of before. So Bonnie studies photobiology of halophiles, which are salt-tolerant bacteria, and microbial diversity of the Great Salt Lake with her undergraduate students. She's interested in astrobiology. At lunch, she just casually dropped the other day that she's been doing astrobiology with NASA, as you do. And she studies applications of extreme hypersaline ecosystems, in particular resistance to ultraviolet light and desiccation by halophiles. And recently, her students have been engaged in projects that involve ancient biomolecules in salt, microbial composition in the Great Salt Lake, stromatolites, okay, and lake microbial mercury methylation. Jaimi is the GSLI coordinator and brings 15 years of Great Salt Lake experience to their programming. She coordinates activities that include developing outreach, so she's done an incredible job of building a community around the Great Salt Lake and Spiral Jetty, mentoring students and designing research projects as an undergraduate in wildlife biology. She studied the Great Salt Lake ecology, and as a professional, she worked for a brine shrimp harvest company, and she knows a lot about brine shrimp, before working for Utah's Division of Wildlife Resources at the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project. She's also a pelican expert and has been at the forefront of researching the effects of water diversion and climate change on the migration patterns, breeding behavior, and survival rates of pelicans on Gunnison Island, which is an island very near to the Spiral Jetty. So, I'm so excited. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Jamie's having trouble, Dan.
I gave you my microphone.
Yeah, that's why you're having trouble. We are so happy to be in New York. It's a little different than Utah, but we've been having a really grand time. I want to start with this phrase: mud, salt, crystals, rocks, water. Does anyone recognize that? Yeah, I know Joey does. When Smithson built Spiral Jetty, he did some writing about the work, and he also did a film, and he repeats this phrase over and over and over: mud, salt, crystals, rocks, water. And Jaimi and I are going to, oh my heavens, these are my best friends. Oh, Bree, nice to see you. Odessa, good to see you again. Wait, David.
We saved
You guys are like,
you the front row.
Yeah, we saved you the front row. Hey, how are you? How's your salt crystal tasting? It's tasting great. Oh, good. We got to meet with some DiaTeens earlier today, so we're kind of excited that they could join us. So when Robert Smithson wrote about Spiral Jetty, he tuned into some observations that he made about the site, and it was what drew him to the site. And we decided to do something kind of funky and different than our usual science talk. We decided to take you through the science with Robert Smithson's words. So any words you see on a slide, other than these first introductory slides, are Robert Smithson's words. And then we will unpack what he saw and tell you something about what we've explored with respect to that. So that's our strategy.
Okay, my microphone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, you got me.
No,
there we go. Okay, I thought I screwed up the microphone. We're from Westminster College. It's a small liberal arts college in Salt Lake City, Utah. And we're so cool that we even get a brine shrimp on our logo. So that's not a trilobite. That's a brine shrimp that's on our logo. They were my first love at Great Salt Lake, and we'll talk about more later.
Well, we have an expert on brine shrimp in the audience. I think, was it Bree? No. What? Yes? You watched a documentary on brine shrimp just this morning, which we were like, what? Who does that before they happen to run into the people who study them? That was awesome.
Well, so Great Salt Lake Institute is all about connecting people to Great Salt Lake through research and education. It seems very simple, but gets a little bit complicated when it has to do with art and different points of view and different people.
We have some guiding principles that we use, and one is be synergistic, one is be non-biased, another is to involve our students, and the last one is to invite the community. So we really try to connect our students to the bigger issues around Great Salt Lake. Oh my God, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
My concern with Salt Lakes began with my work in 1968 on the Mono Lake site, non-site in California. Later, I read a book which describes salt lakes in Bolivia in all stages of desiccation and filled with microbacteria that give the water surface a red color. The basalt at the shores is black, the volcanoes purple, and their exposed interiors yellow and red. The beach is gray and the lake pink, topped with the icing of iceberg-like masses of salts. Because of the remoteness of Bolivia and because Mono Lake lacked a reddish color, I decided to investigate Great Salt Lake in Utah. And so this is our origin stories. Robert Smithson decided to study the lake because of its properties, but this is 2002, and I didn't know anything about it. My friend was like, hey, have you ever heard of this artwork? It's called Spiral Jetty, and it's starting to come out of the water. It hasn't been out of the water for a really long time. So you can see behind, there's some little rocks just peeking out of that pink water. We went to see the pink water, and I just have to say, my son is 17 now, and he's going to his very first dance today. So, this was a long time ago, and a really cool way to look at both the jetty in both time and in place.
Yeah, so this was an abandoned car seat by Spiral Jetty. This was 2003. And I had been drawn to this part of Great Salt Lake because I was looking for extreme life forms, life that could exist in 30% salt at saturation. I was really interested, and it happens to be that there's a good road, not a great road, it's a bad road, but there's a road that in Utah, it's surprising what they call roads. But there's a road that actually goes here through a bunch of ranches and so forth, and so I was able to get access to do some sampling, and I just want to point out my very good mentorship properties here where my students are doing all the work and I'm kind of relaxing on the shore. And so I've spent a lot of time doing science at Great Salt Lake. David, would you read this for me? Would you read Robert Smithson's words?
Okay. Okay. From New York City, I called the Utah Park Development and spoke to Ted Turtle. I can't see it. I'm blind. Oh, I can see it. Who told me that water in the Great Salt Lake north of the Lucin cutoff, which cuts the lake in two, was the color of tomato soup. That was enough of a reason to go out there and have a look.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So this is modern day Great Salt Lake. This was taken by the ISS at NASA, the International Space Station. And so you can see like where it was flooded in the 80s, you can see around here. Spiral Jetty, this is Promontory Point. Spiral Jetty is right in this bay. It's called Roselle Bay. And they built a railroad causeway across, first in the early 1900s, but it allowed the water to flow under. And then in 1959 to about 61, they rock-filled the causeway. And what that means is, go back to one picture, because there's a couple more things I wanted to say there. But what that means is that this water can't exchange with that water. And so Salt Lake City is here. And all of the Wasatch Mountains, their water just flows right into the south arm of the lake. And the north arm is isolated from that water. So it gets salty at saturation. Does anybody know how salty the ocean is? Joey? You live near the ocean? Yeah. 3.4. Where did you learn that? It's like you already went to class. 3.4%. And how salty is the north arm? 30? Yeah, 30. Yeah, thank you. So it's almost 10 times, and in the summer can be 10 times saltier than the ocean. The water is holding as much salt as it can. Okay, so imagine a measuring cup where a third of it is salt. So that's that part. And then this part near the city is not quite as salty. It's at about 12 or 13% right now. That's still way saltier than the ocean, right? So Spiral Jetty is up in this pink water. And this just shows why they built the causeway. This is that north arm of Great Salt Lake. And originally the railroad went way up here, and that's where Golden Spike National Monument actually is. And then this is the current railroad that goes right bisecting the lake right here. Okay. This is the current railroad, what it looks like. You can see on one side is pink water and on one side is bluish green water. And this, they redid the causeway that allows boats to go underneath a couple years ago, and you can see the green water mixing with the pink water. But the density difference is so great that really there's not a lot of mixing. It's just mixing right here at the interface, but it really isn't changing the color of the pink water as a whole.
Can I bug one of you to read?
All right. We visited Charles Stoddard, who supposedly had the only barge on the north side of the cutoff. He was kind enough to take us to Little Valley on the east side of the Lucin cutoff to look for his barge. It had sunk.
So we do a lot of reusing things in Utah, and this was that barge that he was talking about. When I was working for Brine Shrimp harvesters and on the lake, we used that barge to cart all of our brine shrimp cysts around Great Salt Lake, which I think is really cool to have this thing that's sunk, and was part of Robert Smithson's ideas about the industrial parts around Great Salt Lake. The abandoned man-made harbors of Little Valley gave me my first view of the wine-red water, but there were too many keep-out signs around to make that a practical site for anything, and we were told to stay away by 2 angry ranchers. And this happens all the time out there, too. You sometimes can't get past gates, and once you do, you find these really cool gems of places like the Little Valley Harbor. And so when they made that railroad causeway that Bonnie was talking about, they blasted all of this rock out from behind here, and they had a conveyor belt that would bring it right on top of this big platform. And the barge would go underneath that platform, and they would dump their rocks on there from there. And the water's pink, like pink lemonade. I don't think tomato's super red wine at this point, but definitely pink lemonade. And you can see my friends floating in the water because there's so many dissolved solids that you can just float effortlessly, and you can read papers, and you can Superman without getting your face in the salty waters. And it's part of the place that drew Smithson to this strange, unique, salty lake.
We then decided to leave and go to Roselle Point, driving west on Highway 83 late in the afternoon. We passed through Corinne, then went on to Promontory. This is a picture from 1998, the very first time I went out there, and you go through this incredible open valley, and they're just ranchers out there. So you see horses sometimes, you see cattle. We like to bird watch out there. We see burrowing owls and some really amazing wildlife.
Just beyond the Golden Spike Monument, which commemorates the meeting of the rails of the first transcontinental railroad, we went down a dirt road in a wide valley. And this was very important for our entire country, is the meeting of these railroads from east to west. And there were big parties, and we drove a big golden spike into the railroad at that time, and it's now a National Historic Monument. And you can go out there and watch these recreations. And I think it's hilarious because when I was out there last weekend, I watched the train go backwards down the track to go back to this recreation of the meetings, and we felt like this was a very Robert Smithson-like film to put in, and it's kind of shaky, and I might have been driving and filming at the same time. And then you come across these recreations that don't quite look the same, but I guess the intent is there of like celebrating 150 years of the Transcontinental Railroad.
As we traveled, the valley spread into an uncanny immensity, unlike the other landscapes we had seen. The roads on the map became a net of dashes, while in the far distance, the Salt Lake existed as an interrupted silver band. Hills took on the appearance of melting solids and glowed under amber light. We followed roads that glided away into dead ends. Sandy slopes turned into viscous masses of perception. Slowly we drew near to the lake, which resembled an impassive, faint violet sheet held captive in a stony matrix upon which the sun poured down its crushing light. This is my first group of students in 1998 that I took out there, and we are actually just for the very first time getting a glimpse of a band of Great Salt Lake right there. And these purple, majestic mountains. I just put a laser on your head, just so you know. I have a sniper around the corner. Okay, go ahead.
An expanse of salt flats bordered the lake. I'm going to interject and say we used to call it the Sodium Coast. And caught its sediments were countless bits of wreckage. Old piers were left high and dry. The mere sight of the trapped fragments of junk and waste transported one into a world of modern prehistory, the products of a Devonian industry, the remains of a Silurian technology. All the machines of the upper Carboniferous period were lost in those expansive deposits of sand and mud. And you find this in many parts of the lake. This was an old pier that they used when they were exploring industries on the lake. And some of our students are standing where water would have covered this, and there would have been a platform on top of this for some of these industries. 2 dilapidated shacks look over a tired group of oil rigs. A series of seeps of heavy black oil, more like asphalt, occurred just south of Roselle Point. For 40 or more years, people have tried to get the oil out of this natural tar pool. Pumps coated with black stickiness rusted in the corrosive salt air. A hut mounted on pilings could have been the habitation of the missing link. A great pleasure arose from seeing all of those incoherent structures. This site gave evidence of a succession of man-made systems mired in abandoned hopes. This is clearly some abandoned hopes, right? This like dilapidated shack where Bonnie made her students go, and there's an old amphibious vehicle that's sitting on the shores that's since been taken out. And you find these tar seeps, and these are some natural seeps that just bubble out of the ground. They kind of escape through fissures in the substrate and then spread out like sticky tar paper on the surface of the lake bed. We have some students out here that are putting camera traps in here. So they have these motion activated cameras that we're putting out because we can study these tar pits as an analog to places like La Brea tar pits. And you can see these are some bird bones. These are future fossils that we'll be studying, and studying the layers of how these dead birds turn into fossils. Every time I go to the lake, I find new stuff, new, weird, crazy things. This was last weekend, and you can see this water and tar just bubbling out of the earth. The narrative, I had my 6-year-old daughter with me, and the narrative behind this is hilarious. I'm glad you can't hear it.
If you could hear the sound, she's saying things like, "Mom, can we go to the car?"
And some people shush their kids in church, and I shush my kid to listen to tar bubbling. And these birds, there's 10 million birds that come to Great Salt Lake for one reason or another, and sometimes those birds get trapped in these sticky, asphalty tar seeps.
And this is within view of Spiral Jetty. I just want to say it's right there. It's right next door.
Oftentimes people mistake this old oil exploration jetty for Spiral Jetty. As you kind of come upon Roselle Point to turn, you see this big jetty, and a lot of people mistake it.
About 1 mile north of the oil seeps, I selected my site. Irregular beds of limestone dip gently eastward. Massive deposits of black basalt are broken over the peninsula, giving the region a shattered appearance. This is a picture I took of Spiral Jetty, and in the foreground are these big clumps of basalt rock. So there's just tons of this basalt out there. And basalt is a volcanic rock. This is from millions of years of volcanic activity, millions of years ago, in this part of Utah. And what Robert Smithson did was said, hey, there's this incredible rock that's nearby. I would like to mine that and use that to make Spiral Jetty. So we love the way it blends in with the natural landscape, like it just comes out of the rocks. And when he talked about the shattered appearance, I can't help but think about the aerial view of all of these mud cracks filled with salt that we see on the beach. It is one of the few places on the lake where the water comes right up to the mainland. Under shallow pinkish water is a network of mud crack supporting the jigsaw puzzle that composes the salt flats. And we do see these mud flats, this fractured appearance. And this is a nice picture because there's the sculpture, but then here's the road and the parking lot up above the basalt hills right there. So I study the microbes that make the water pink. The reason I went there was the pink water. And when my students take this salt or this pink water and we put it on petri dishes, we grow these amazing microorganisms out. And you can tell what color they are, right? So when people tell you brine shrimp make the water pink, tell them they're wrong. It actually is the microorganisms in the water that you can't see, but you can see the pigments. So they have carotenoid pigments, much like these beautiful colors on the wall. They have carotenoid pigments, like it's named for carrots, sweet potatoes, watermelon. We're used to seeing carotenoids in the plant world, right? But we have carotenoids here. And I'll tell you a little more about what they do for the organism later.
Can you hear me? Oh, as I looked at the site, it reverberated out to the horizons, only to suggest an immobile cyclone, while flickering light made the entire landscape appear to quake. A dormant earthquake spread into the fluttering stillness, into a spinning sensation without movement. This site was a rotary that enclosed itself in an immense roundness. And so for many years, we've been coming out to Great Salt Lake to study Bonnie's sexy pink microbes. And we've been looking at this picture for a long time, and I think it's really interesting that we're all looking at the water, and this flock of pelicans is flying over our heads. And it reminded me of the cyclone that he was talking about. I want you to watch how these pelicans are flying over my head, and they catch these thermals. So the way that they save energy instead of flapping their wings is to catch thermals that are rising off the land or off of the water, and they circle and circle until they can hit air currents that are very high in the sky, and then they are propelled to wherever they're going. And you know, we thought it was kind of weird. We were like, Robert Smithson never mentioned our American white pelicans in his work, and we still don't really understand this, but we started thinking, you know, he was really building this in early April. He started in April, and this is one of our nerdy computer science students did this. So we don't just have biology students or environmental studies students, we have computer science students that are helping us, and you can see from all of his computer science language that we don't see any birds until early April. And maybe Robert Smithson just wasn't there at a time when these pelicans are flying overhead. And again, another graph of, you know, after early April, they really start coming in large numbers. And
Maybe you should stop just a minute, because I would like to know, raise your hand in the room if you've ever been to the Spiral Jetty. Awesome.
Was anybody there in the summer, like June, July, August?
Have you seen pelicans? Yeah. Yeah, okay. They're so obvious, and it's such a place that feels so still that when they flap their wings, you hear the noise. And so the thought that Robert Smithson could have been building this and not noticing the pelicans is kind of shocking to us.
We just can't understand it.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to see a pelican.
Yeah.
And so we've been working with our students studying the pelicans that live on an island that's west of Spiral Jetty. And we do this a number of ways. These are baby pelicans that we've corralled in a little slow-moving stampede. They can't fly yet, but they're almost an adult size. And we herd them into a little area where we can put markers on them. So you'll notice this is an almost full-grown baby pelican. But it has these markers on its wings that we can follow and think about questions like survival rates and where they're feeding and where they migrate. And they're not really stoked on being caught. I mean, pelicans don't make a lot of noise, except for when we do this.
That baby's about 3 feet tall, just so you get an idea how big these things are.
And we kind of think of our pelicans as the polar bears of Great Salt Lake because, I mean, all of us, probably not very many of us have ever been to the Arctic, but we all know polar bears, and we all know that the ice sheets are melting and that global climate change is a reality. And so we've been thinking about our pelicans as the polar bear of Great Salt Lake because you might not know what a little eared grebe is or what an American avocet is, but almost everybody knows a pelican and hardly anybody hates hates pelicans. And so anglers sometimes hate pelicans, so I have to say almost nobody. And so we started this program because pelicans are very shy. They know better to hang out by people, and we weren't really sure how we could study them better because they're on this remote island, and if you go onto this island, if people or coyotes go onto this island, the pelicans will abandon. They'll totally take off and leave their babies behind, leave their eggs behind. And so we hatched a scheme, and we put all of these cameras on Gunnison Island. And so these are all motion-activated cameras that are capturing...
Wait, go back. For the first time, I'm not an animal behavior person, but I'm pretty sure those pelicans are having dance parties when nobody's looking, right?
And sometimes they fight with their neighbors. The good neighbor policy is that you should be 2 beak lengths apart from your nearest neighbor. And like that often applies to kids in the back seat on car rides. Sometimes they taste our cameras. They like to check out sunsets like we do. And sometimes they take selfies of themselves. And these are all really fun and quirky, and we can laugh at them, but we also get to watch for things like eggs. So these are all things that people don't just get to see. They'll take off. They're just so shy. And this is really important because the water levels of Great Salt Lake in the past 11 years have declined by about 11 feet. And that's very significant for a lake that's on average 13 feet in depth. And the shorelines have shrunk around Great Salt Lake about 40%. So it's almost half the size that it would be at normal lake levels because our climate is getting warmer and because we've diverted water from going into our lake. And remember, it's a basin, it's a terminal lake, and so everything that goes into Great Salt Lake stays there except water through evaporation. And so if you have more water going out through evaporation and not in through the river systems or through rain, that decreases. And we were watching land bridges form to this island that was previously predator-free and got really worried about it. You can now go, this is a community-based science program or a citizen science project. You can go to a site called Zooniverse, and you can come get a card later if you're really interested. And you can help us analyze the 200,000 images of pelicans that we've collected over the past 2 years. And, I mean, what do they have to do with Spiral Jetty? I mean, we're talking about Robert Smithson and Spiral Jetty, but it turns out, so here's Gunnison Island right here, and remember Spiral Jetty's right here, and they're fresh water that they need because pelicans, I mean, we all probably know pelicans eat fish. Their fish are over here. And so Spiral Jetty is right about halfway. It's the halfway point between their breeding grounds and their feeding grounds. And so oftentimes visitors to Spiral Jetty they'll see pelicans flying over in the summertime, and sometimes you might see some of those young pelicans that are making their very first trip. I'm also reminded of my kid who just started driving. If he had to drive 30 miles, I don't know if he would make it either. And some of those pelicans don't quite make it from there. And you'll oftentimes see dead pelicans in social media for Spiral Jetty. After securing a 20-year lease on the meandering zone and finding a contractor in Ogden, I began to build the jetty in April of 1970. He wrote it in green crayon. He wrote this really important lease in green crayon because he could, and he did. And the thing I think, we can't see it very well. The thing that I think is really interesting is that this letter went to the state agency that manages the bed of Great Salt Lake in March of 1970. So, this was rapid fire. This incredible piece of land art happened in just months.
And each cubic salt crystal echoes the spiral jetty in terms of the crystal's molecular lattice. Growth in a crystal advances around the dislocation point in the manner of a screw. The spiral jetty could be considered one layer within the spiraling crystal lattice, magnified trillions of times. So I'm passing around, Jaimi's passing around some really special kind of salt crystals, a little different than what we shared with the teens earlier today. These are hopper crystals, and they do form in a spiral, and we get them out of the lake when the weather changes in the fall and the water gets cool. These drop out of the water, and there's no way Robert Smithson could have seen those at that time of year. So I think it's almost like he predicted their existence, which is very cool. They form like little pyramids as the salt comes out of the water. So I've gotten really interested in what kinds of microorganisms can get stuck in them, because they're riddled with these little fluid inclusions, these little pockets of water get stuck in here. And so microorganisms can be in that water, in that pink water that gets stuck inside the salt crystal, right? So that's part of why I study salt biology. I'm just astounded by the way that these organisms push the limits of life. So this is a gypsum crystal. It's also called selenite if you buy it in your rock shop. But if you've been on the beaches where Spiral Jetty is, these gypsum crystals come out. They're like blades sticking blade up in the sands. And we found this old diagram. Is this the one? Other way. We found this old diagram that shows these gypsum crystals sticking just in this clay just beneath this surface of sand. So we dig down a little bit, and sure enough, we find these incredible crystals. What's cool about these, is that we've started doing some experiments where we take some of these gypsum crystals and we take some of these salt crystals, and you can see that we are actually right by Spiral Jetty. So I will say this is my laboratory, right? And I'm working with NASA on these experiments. So these crystals, the gypsum crystals, can do the same things. They can hold on to these little fluid inclusions. So how can they hold life, and how long can they hold life, and what kind of molecules are preserved? Those are the questions that we're asking. A crack in the wall, if viewed in terms of scale, not size, could be called the Grand Canyon. A room could be made to take on the immensity of the solar system. So I often think about the solar system when I'm out at Spiral Jetty as well. This is a crater on Mars discovered by the rover Opportunity. This is not the current crater where Curiosity is at Gale Crater. This is the Endurance Crater. But many of these lakes dried up and became salt lakes. And as they dried up and the water went away, they left salt and gypsum behind. So there's a bunch of salt and gypsum on Mars, and the rovers have taken samples and they send back the geology data, so we know that. So here's my question. If life can be preserved in salt and gypsum on our planet, on Earth, from some experiments I and others have done over millions of years, is it possible that life can be preserved in these minerals on Mars? So this is a really cool picture. This is from the current rover Curiosity, and these are gypsum crystals sticking out as blades, and this is right by Spiral Jetty, where you also see these gypsum crystals sticking out at blades. And this is an upcoming rover. So we send a mission to Mars every 2 years. Does anybody know why that is? Every 26 months, our planets come close enough together that it makes it energetically feasible. It costs less money to send. So that's why you'll see a mission go up every 2 years, approximately. So the next rover, the next rover is Mars 2020, and it has on it an arm that does a type of spectroscopy that will look for organic molecules. It will drive over these salt and gypsum beds, and it will read vibrations of atoms and look for organic molecules in the salt and gypsum. So this is why I've been working with people at NASA about Great Salt Lake as an analog for Mars. We're interested in these minerals and how they can hold life over time. If that lake had biology at some point in history on Mars, and 3.4 billion years ago, Mars lost surface water, is it possible that any aquatic life is remaining, or its molecules are preserved in those minerals? So that's why we're working with NASA at Spiral Jetty, which is pretty awesome.
On the edge of the water at the beginning of the tale, the wheels of the truck sank into a quagmire of sticky gumbo mud. A whole afternoon was spent filling in this spot. Once the trucks passed this problem, there was always the chance that the salt crust resting on the mud flaps would break through. The spiral jetty was staked out in such a way as to avoid the soft muds that broke up through the salt crust. Nevertheless, there were some mud fissures that could not be avoided. One could only hope that the tension would hold the entire jetty together, and it did. And so when you're walking on the mud flats and salt flats and the beaches near Spiral Jetty, this is what it looks like. You can see, a person for perspective. And sometimes our students think it's really cool and therapeutic. I mean, people at the Dead Sea do this. I mean, it's very therapeutic with the salts and the minerals, and mostly I think it's really fun. The scale of Spiral Jetty tends to fluctuate depending on where the viewer happens to be. Size determines an object, but scale determines art. And we can see from the International Space Station, I mean, we can't see Spiral Jetty. We can kind of see where it might be. And lucky for us, DiaArt Foundation started taking satellite images of Spiral Jetty. And over the years, in this image...
You're from a balloon, right? Not satellite, yeah.
It originally from a balloon.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But you can see there's water covering the jetty, and you can't see a lot of definition, as opposed to this one was in 2012, where the water levels are kind of far away.
Can I just mention that when we first started working out there, we thought of Spiral Jetty as a water gauge to tell us how much water was in the lake at the time, and it still kind of works that way.
It does. It gives us perspective, even when we look at pictures when my kid was 1 year old versus today when he goes out. Well, he doesn't like to go out with me, but if he did, the picture would be very much different. And again, I mean, like the perspective and the scale when going in from the macro to the micro, it definitely impacts us. And all of these water levels are impacting not just our lake, but the things that live in our lake and the way that we view the lake and our human environment. On the slopes of Roselle Point, I closed my eyes, and the sun burned crimson through the lids. I opened them, and the Great Salt Lake was bleeding scarlet streaks. My sight was saturated by the color or red algae circling in the heart of the lake, pumping into ruby currents. No, they were veins and arteries sucking up the obscure sediments. And because the Great Salt Lake is a terminal lake, there's 22,000, everything that goes in from this 22,000 square miles of watershed and the rivers that kind of look like arteries and veins, they go into Great Salt Lake. And a lot of people have told me about Great Salt Lake kind of being the heart of our Great Basin, this basin that we live in. And it's not a place of closure or stoppage, and it's not, and sometimes it does smell because there's so much life in it, but life doesn't stop there. The lake is a place of transformation and energy that moves, of movement that keeps going, not just from the lake and not just to us, but all around the globe through the birds that come and migrate, and the salts that leave Great Salt Lake that we sell, and the brine shrimp that we send around the world for use in fish food and aquaculture.
I had the red heaves while the sun vomited its corpuscular radiations. Rays of glare hit my eyes with the frequency of a Geiger counter. So one of the reasons I study this pink water, as I've mentioned, are the microorganisms. And sometimes you find them not just in the water, but embedded in the salt, right? And the secret behind these organisms living in that extreme UV radiation, that extreme sunlight, is these pigments. These pigments, that's the secret to the fact that they avoid skin cancer. Okay, they can't get skin cancer. They avoid DNA damage. Like, we couldn't do that. We couldn't handle that much radiation because we would collect DNA damage and get mutations and get skin cancer, right? But they can, and these pigments are there for a reason. They act as a shield from UV light. You even see that when you grow them in a flask, you can see the pink color.
One of our students did projects on how none of us want kinky DNA, because that's what it happens. It puts a little kink in your DNA.
Yeah, the DNA damage actually causes a physical bend. Once when I was flying over the lake, its surface seemed to hold all of the properties of an unbroken field of raw meat with gristle. No doubt it was due to some freak wind action. This is what the foam looks like as you fly over Great Salt Lake, and it really does look like gristle and meat. So the foam sometimes washes up on the shore, and it's like a giant bubble bath. If you're ever out there on a windy day, you'll see, we call them like foam tumbleweeds blowing over the spiral jetty. And that's because of these microbes that I study with my students. They release these lipids from their cells when they die, and these lipids cause this bubble bath to happen.
And I used to go on boats, and we would find these foam bergs that would be like blown right offshore, and we would ride. It would be like the coastline in foam just in the water, and we would take our boats and we would drive through the foam bergs, and they would vortex in the cabin behind us, like those money machines where the like dollars catch all the dollars. It was like that, except with Great Salt Lake foam. Sorry, I had to interject that.
The equation of my language remains unstable, a shifting set of coordinates, an arrangement of variables spilling into surds. My equation is clear as mud, a muddy spiral.
From the gyrating space emerged the possibility of the spiral jetty. And from the spiral jetty, we have a lot of possibilities that have been given to us, both in access to do our science and to introduce people to the pink water and the microbes and the pelicans of Great Salt Lake. And we think that the partnership between Dia Art Foundation and the Utah Museum of Fine Arts and Great Salt Lake Institute, as well as the land managers, is a very creative and important way to problem solve some of these really interesting changes that are happening in our world with politics and climate change, and just different views that people have of our world. That just going on this expedition with somebody in the van with you brings together all of these interesting viewpoints that we didn't have. We would go on our nerdy science journeys, and has made our life and the work that we do at Great Salt Lake so much more robust and just very cool and meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. And this collaboration got us very interested in science and art, and the process of science and the process of art, and how those things overlap, and how scientists are creative and artists are creative, and how those two endeavors really aren't that different sometimes. And that's led us to get funding in the realm of science-art collaboratives, and working together. We've been having art students work with science students in our undergraduate research program based on this grant. So I really want to thank Dia for hosting us, and for the years that we've spent collaborating. It's spectacular, and it has enriched our work. It's enriched our science. So we're really happy to be here, and we'd love to take any questions you have about Great Salt Lake. She'll only talk about pelicans, but I'll talk about anything else.
Oh, and brine shrimp. I can talk about brine shrimp, too.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
We're going to pass around it's not an offering cup, even though it looks like it. But we're going to pass around, there's some stickers and Brine Shrimp temporary tattoos. And cards.
If you're interested in the Pelican Project, there's a card, and there's our business card has Great Salt Lake map in the middle of it, so that might be fun.
I just wanted to know how, wow, this microphone's very cool. How old are these organisms you find trapped in the salt on Earth?
Yeah, very good. So one of the coolest experiments I did was going underground in a salt mine in New Mexico, and that salt people have grown microbes out of. I imaged DNA and cellulose and biological molecules out of it. That salt is 253 million years old. So we imaged the oldest biological molecules ever found on the Earth. So in other words, DNA doesn't just exist in the environment, it has to be produced by biology, right? So 253 million years is before the dinosaurs emerged on our planet. So we think salt, it's kind of funny because the ancient Egyptians talked about salt as a preservative, right? And cultures have used salt as a preservative. But in these fluid inclusions under the ground in a salt deposit, really biological molecules can last a long time. So I'm going back to that Carlsbad spot in New Mexico at the end of January for a NASA meeting on biomarkers in minerals that might be on Mars. So that should be really fun. So at least 253 million years, and maybe older, maybe longer. So we're looking at a modern environment in Great Salt Lake, but we're using it as an analog to think about what gets trapped.
And it's really cool because I get to be on these papers, and some of these papers, all I did was collect mud and salt and gypsum, and I don't even know what the titles of these things mean, and I'm still an author.
I really enjoyed this, and I can't imagine how thrilled Smithson would have been to see this outcome, but I wonder if you have any inkling through Nancy Holt,
Yes.
what he would have thought of all of this. It just seems like ideal for him.
We had the most amazing opportunity to go to the Spiral Jetty with Nancy Holt, and before she died, and Nancy Holt was Smithson's wife. And she's a very accomplished artist and has another piece of work in the desert of Utah. And she had a show in Utah, and we got to take her to Spiral Jetty. So I got to sit on this basalt with her and look at Spiral Jetty and ask her questions about what was he thinking, right? What was he thinking when he was doing this? Because I'm sure he didn't write everything down. And as you sit there on the parking lot bank above Spiral Jetty and you look at all the mountains around, Utah's a beautiful place, and you see this pink water. And she said he talked about all of the mountain ranges like being in a spiral around us, and that was like bringing this work together in his head. Like the site was really important. And also if you look at his other work, which I've been introduced to by these lovely folks, he was all about entropy. And to me, for instance, there are people who think that Spiral Jetty should be restored. It was underwater for more than 20 years, and then it emerged as the lake went under a series of drought years. And that emergence brought so much excitement, and I had to think that Robert Smithson would have loved that work disappeared and then reappeared. And also I have to think that he probably didn't predict that part, right? I mean, people knew that terminal lakes went up and down. He never wrote about that part that I know of. But I think he would have loved that, and he would love that it emerged a little different with salt crystals on the rocks at first, and some, they're more buried down in the ground now, and I have to think he would love that. And the more I read about him and think about his words, I feel like I would love it. You know that that college application question about like if you could go back in time and have dinner with somebody and have a conversation, like I'd love to have this conversation with him. Like, dude, your artwork went underwater for 25 years and then it came back out again. Isn't that cool? You know, or if he'd be like, yeah, it's really a bummer, you know. So I feel like I have some sense that he would love it, but I don't know how much of that I'm imagining.
I wouldn't want to sit on a park bench. I'd like to go to Mim's Bar and Grill with him. That's kind of his place where I used to go to this cowboy bar, and when you walk in there, the music turns off and all the cowboy hats turn towards you. And I would have loved to go sit and have a beer with Robert Smithson and Nancy
You forgot
Lowell.
the part about the smoke rolling out of the door when you open the door. Yeah, it's a serious cowboy bar. My favorite factlet about Corinne, the little town that's on your way to Promontory Point, is that they used to have in the early 1900s a vending machine for divorces. Corinne was like the non-Mormon part of Utah, and it was this really cowboy town with like all the bad boys were there.
Did you have a question?
Yes. Hello. I'm a bit of a land art novice, and so I'm just curious experientially how large it is when you get there. Like how wide and how long, and how does it feel when you're walking up to it?
Yeah, she's going to get a picture up. So I know Dia likes to show the artwork without humans on it, right? Because it's this pristine artwork picture, but you miss that scale when you don't have a human on it, right? And my husband's a geologist, and they always photograph things with a human in the picture, and they'll say human for scale, and it cracks me up, right? But I think it's useful in this case. Do you want to show, do you have one with people on the Jetty? I don't know that we do, but you guys, Alexis, you know the dimensions.
Yeah, it's 1,500 feet long if from start to finish. So that includes the length of the spiral, which is a little bit taller than the Empire State Building. But how wide?
It's about as wide as like one set of these chairs. And so it really is, it does feel like a Buddhist meditative walk when you walk the spiral. A lot of people like to walk the spiral.
This is, you can't see very well, but these are the two edges of Spiral Jetty. So
It feels like a road.
Yeah, it feels like a road, yeah. And it also holds lots of scientific equipment and students.
And I would say for land art novices, I accidentally started working at Great Salt Lake. I accidentally started going to all of these cool pieces of land art. And what I didn't realize is how important the journey was. This journey of going and having this experience with your friends and taking a cooler, and maybe you get a flat tire, or hopefully you don't.
Or you could break a bus. We broke a bus one time.
And maybe you get lost, but you spend a day with your people, and you have this experience that sometimes is a little uncomfortable, that you might not be totally excited for parts of the trip. And that's part of this experience of getting out into a place that I would never have traveled there, to Spiral Jetty.
We didn't say this, but it's a 2.5-hour drive from Salt Lake City. So it's not like you go to Salt Lake and then you go to Spiral Jetty. It's like a whole day. You drive there and you spend the day. You come back really covered in salt and kind of tired, but lovely, yeah. Maria wears black and then she gets salt all over. You don't ever wear black at Spiral Jetty. She comes back with, you did it you learned, see? Other questions, Joey?
So do you find it, I probably don't need that. Do you find it interesting that there's similar things on Mars as here, and where did the salt origin, what's the origin of salt?
The origin of salt?
Yeah.
The origin of salt on our planet is always from water. So salt deposits are from lakes that concentrated salts as they evaporated, so the water went away and the salts got more and more concentrated, and then the water went away. So geologists call salt deposits evaporites. So like the word "ite," the ending "ite," like meteorite, means rock. So it's rock created from evaporation, right? So literally they call evaporites. So it's literally rocks that evaporated. So they come from water. They come from oceans and seas.
So there was water on Mars.
There was water on Mars. See you guys. Email me. You're my new best friends. Yes, there was standing water on Mars until 3.4 billion years ago, which was just after life appeared on Earth. We had very similar atmospheres until that time. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, hi, can you tell us a bit more about the industries? And you did say brine shrimp, and I'm still dying to hear about brine shrimp.
Oh my God, are you going home with Jaimi?
Yeah, you're my best friend. You're my best friend. So, brine shrimp are one of the only macroinvertebrates that live in Great Salt Lake for their entire life cycle. And they have the highest tolerance in salinity, so the levels of salt in the water, than any other organism. They can live from
Any other animal.
2% salinity up to 19% salinity water. And so Great Salt Lake just happens to have tons of nutrients and little micro algae and bacterias that these brine shrimp filter feed. And so sometimes in Great Salt Lake, you'll find the same amount of biomass in brine shrimp at one time in the summer as 1.8 million people. And so they're very prolific and very productive, and at the end of their season, they lay these hard-shelled cysts. They're covered in this keratin shell that can withstand desiccation and high salt content and all sorts of things, even Coca-Cola, just in case you're wondering. And people that are cysts, not cysts all around the world, float, but our Great Salt Lake cysts, they float on the surface of the water and they look kind of like a streak of oil. And so people go out with oil containment boom, just like they would if there was an oil spill, and they encircle it and they scoop it up with this oil containment boom. And so last year alone, they took 35 million pounds of cysts off of Great Salt Lake. And so just that industry brings in like $50 to $70 million to the state of Utah. But there's also lots of salt that comes into Great Salt Lake. There's widely varying estimates from 2 to 59 million pounds of salt that comes into Great Salt Lake every year. So we don't have a good handle on how much is coming in, but about 2 million pounds of different salts and minerals are extracted just by evaporation. So we put the water of Great Salt Lake into these big pools of that we evaporate, and different minerals and salts fall out at different rates. So we can harvest not just sodium chloride, but also magnesium compounds, and potassium sulfate is one of the really big ones that people use as organic fertilizer to grow the food that we eat. And so between that and magnesium extraction, the lake is valued at about $1.3 billion annually. So it's very important economically to our state, not just to our environment.
And it is the most important body of water in the West for birds on the Pacific Flyway. So the 10 million birds that come there, many of them are migratory, and they need to stop over and eat Jaimi's brine shrimp.
Is Gunnison Island.
So,
Yeah.
So she's asking about the coyotes because she knows the secret that coyotes got onto Gunnison Island where the pelicans breed. And right now we haven't seen any detrimental effects. We think that the coyotes are just going out there in the winter when there's not a lot of food elsewhere. They're going out there to scavenge on some of the dead birds or rodents that live out there, and it's probably a pretty quiet place. We haven't seen any decrease in pelican populations or wily coyote sabotaging baby pelicans or anything. But that's still to be determined, and we did find a person out there. So
with this motion-activated camera.
When some of our two-legged predators were out there, which is probably more scary than even those coyotes on the island. Humans are much more destructive and devious.
Anybody else? Thank you guys so much for coming.